The Rise and Fall and Return and Revenge of World of Warcraft, from Vanilla to Nostalrius, a memoir. I'd like to talk about World of Warcraft, the journey I've had with it, and how I've watched it change. At time of writing, it's April 2016. The current expansion is Warlords of Draenor, and Legion is soon to be released. But this isn't the World of Warcraft that I want to start with. There was a time, I recall. It feels like aeons ago now. A golden age that sits in my fading memory like a jewel in the eye of a crumbling statue. It was early in 2005, and World of Warcraft went live in Europe. I was among those excitedly anticipating the game before its arrival, ready and eager to get on board at launch, and in the process, start a relationship with a video game that would go deeper and last longer than I would have imagined possible. It was a time and place of adventure, of fascination, and of obsession. It started on February the 11th, for the ones who got in early at any rate. For most people, including me, it started closer to the 12th, as the sheer number of players trying to register their accounts simultaneously had crashed the website early on the day of launch. Consequently, no one could create an account to log in until it was restored, much later that evening. After extended deliberation, I made a Night Elf warrior and logged in. The forests of Teldrassil were my first glimpse of what awaited of a vast, seamless world, teeming with activity and the promise of discovery. And everything that happened in that one world. Everyone on the server saw the same thing. What was for one was for all. That fact alone made it seem so much more important. It stretched out seemingly endlessly, incomprehensibly wide, inviting and mysterious in equal measure. It was waiting to be explored. I was charmed and enthralled by the bold, bright, chunky visual aesthetic, a stark contrast to the dull, toned-down trappings employed by the majority of the other fantasy MMO games of the time. I was intoxicated by the exciting buzz of the community, perpetually there, gibbering away, sharing the experience together, all embarked on the same challenge. A journey that took you through dark, dense, gloomy forests infested with spiders and ghouls, into lush, primordial jungles where raptors lurk around ancient troll ruins, over and under the winding paths of snowy mountain peaks, mined and tunneled by industrious small people, or squelching through soggy marshlands, ever fearful of the gargling cry of an incoming horde of murlocs that you didn't notice were there. It was all so fresh and vibrant and alive. I found the game astoundingly engaging, if not easy. I didn't really know what to do, where to go next, how to make anywhere near enough gold for my needs, what items were optimal for me stat-wise, how exactly my class was meant to be played, or indeed, how most of the less obvious mechanics even worked. The colloquial term, I believe, is noob. Nevertheless, it took my imagination and ran wild with it. As the months flew by, I became more familiar with this strange new world. I started to get a feel for the lay of the land as quests took me further afield. I started to learn map directions by heart, and explored all the little nooks and crannies I found along the way. Through the constant back and forth of questing, I really got to know each area and all their many varied denizens, most of which wanted to kill me, and quite a few then were frequently successful if given the opportunity. It didn't help that warrior was not a very forgiving class back then. And I didn't have the best gear either, but I was proud of what I had. I felt like I'd earned every mismatched piece, and the few blue items I had took pride of place in my inventory. Meanwhile, my subconscious was starting to become ever more saturated with WoW's assets. Snatches of the music, or oft-heard sounds like the clink of looting coins or those little noises that happen upon opening or closing a UI panel, would pop into my head unbidden, reminding me exactly how much I wanted to play WoW right at that moment, usually quite a lot. I sometimes saw the minimap or XP bar lingering when I closed my eyes. I was totally in the groove and digging it. I didn't even know what one did at the end of the game, and I didn't much care. The joy of the process of leveling there, in that world at that time, compelled me like a moth to a flame. I've enjoyed many video games thus far in my life, but none in quite the same way as World of Warcraft. It was a good time. A time that when I come to think of in detail, stirs in me great nostalgia. An age and a world interwoven heavily and inextricably with my life during a fairly substantial part of my formative years. World of Warcraft has undoubtedly influenced who I am as a person, for better or worse, probably to quite a large degree. It served as a space for an aspect of my personality to develop in for years. I spent as much time in it doing whatever the fuck it is other people enjoy doing. People have all kinds of pastimes, some more obsessively than others. Music, painting, books, Lego, comics, movies, pornography, birdwatching, narcotics, sports, fishing, fisting, browsing forums. Whatever you like, I'm not here to shit on you for it. It's all something to get by until we die. I'm glad of any enjoyment I get. Anyway, Warcraft. For me, it was one of those pieces of pop culture that resonates with you particularly deeply for whatever reason and kind of sticks. And most of those, for me, live within the realms of fantasy and sci-fi. There's a special place in my heart for fantastical worlds I like to delve into, such as The Lord of the Rings, Warhammer, or Star Trek, preferably The Next Generation, the finest television show ever made. The kind of things that have picked up a cult following of like-minded individuals. Warcraft wasn't some flash-in-the-pan, flavor-of-the-month fantasy setting, but a serious heavyweight contender in the arena of things that nerds will spend time and money on because they like it. But aside from the elements of fantasy, the gameplay also satiated in me some kind of primal desire to complete familiarly repetitive and relatively involved tasks, but not so fast-paced as to be overly taxing to the concentration, and so sustainable for long periods of time. Perfectly suited to the level of input needed for WoW's model of go somewhere, kill the people, and take their shit to get rewards. It's a very slowly paced style of game compared to some more twitchy types like your Doom or Fight Fighter, and I appreciate them too. Point being, people call this style of gameplay a grind for a reason. The process of average gameplay is, if you are unaware, characteristically slow and repetitive, and there's a constant logistical metagame to keep in mind and manage on top of that. For example, while out questing, you'd usually be engaged in several longer-term tasks, running parallel to the main objective of the quests. Stuff like collecting relevant resources for professions, managing your inventory space, and keeping stock of consumables actively needed for questing, such as food, drink, ammo, spell reagents, etc., all of which would eventually require a visit into town, and more infrequently a city, when you leveled up some aspect of your character and need to visit the auction house, repair battered and useless equipment, or whatever. It all took time, and getting a good enough chunk of your quests completed before needing to return to the nearest hub wasn't always a smooth task. Things could go wrong. You could get lost, misinterpret occasionally ambiguous quest directions, be unable to find an NPC, or get a random drop for an unfortunately long time, or sometimes just find yourself in a particular situation that your specific class turns out to be quite ineffective at surviving, and you die ignominiously. And then there's always a bug every now and then to make things interesting. The reason I love this style of gameplay is partially because the slow pacing elicits a very relaxed state in me, allowing me to deeply immerse myself into the atmosphere of the setting and take in the ambience of the world, which in this instance is not only stylistically lush, but persistent and huge. It gets me in a way that faster-paced or more segmented games simply don't, usually at a trade-off for more instantaneous gratification. But what WoW got perfect, for me at any rate, was the ratio of effort and time to reward. It made you work a lot and gave you a little, but that little was so sweet as a result of what you'd invested into getting it. When I finally saved up a huge enough stack of gold to afford my first ever mount, I nearly jizzed myself with excitement. 60%! Such unthinkable speed. That's why World of Warcraft had a great formula, providing a robust framework of quests, class mechanics, and professions that seemed to please the doing tasky things worker-drone part of my brain to engage with, and the rich and endearing Warcraft setting intrigued the part of my brain that thinks about wizards and goblins. A formula executed, in my opinion, extremely well. It was a great time. But times change. After more than 2 years, the burning crusade arrived from out of the twisting nether, and its coming brought new wonders to the world of Warcraft. And indeed, I took much delight in traversing the surreal vistas of Outland. It was, however, during this period that I believe certain game mechanics and structures took a direction that, many years down the line, would twist and distort the underlying nature of World of Warcraft into something similar yet different. Then again, it could have been that the seeds of change were buried in the game's fundamental formula right from the start, and that this period just saw the first, most noticeable patterns emerge. It wasn't so much that it was straying from the formula, but reinterpreting it, changing in a way that only time and natural aging would bring to the forefront of the gameplay. I'm talking about the slow perversion of the fundamental drip feed of rewards at the core of the game's design, and how the continual release of new areas, content, and mechanical updates eventually altered the nature of the game from a slow, thorough progression from one end of Azeroth to the other, with hard-earned rewards every now and then, leading to a similarly slow and hard endgame, into a quick and shallow progression, skimming across vast multitudes of mostly forgotten landscapes full of semi-redundant content, quickly into an endgame based around a small hub, where rewards roll in from sustaining a daily plethora of localized odd jobs and mini-quests, with many features of the game that previously required time and energy to set up, now instantly and easily accessible thanks to many quick or instant travel options or matchmaking systems. Much more efficient to get the end result of the activity in question completed, i.e. go to dungeon, kill boss, kill quest NPCs, hand in quest, etc., but eliminated most of the journey, literal and figurative, required to get there, thus undermining what I most loved in the game, the relevance of the actual world to the majority of the gameplay. To illustrate my point, I'll continue back where I left off, the Burning Crusade. And it would do it an injustice not to talk of it without saying that I absolutely loved this one. The sudden steroid injection of high-concept sci-fi fantasy to the setting seemed so fresh, and the surreal, psychedelic, acid-trip vibe of the visual direction totally melted my mind. The music alone gets me deep. The mournful horns that play in Honor Hold still send shivers down my spine when I think about them. Some of the areas in Outland are among my favourite places to be, and I'm including places in the real world there. Anyway, having completed the not inconsiderable task of levelling a mage to 70 through this vivid dreamscape, I took to the skies on a majestic snow-white griffin of my very own. And there, in the high places of the world, I made friends with the ogres and the Shartari Skyguard, aka the Sporebat guys. And they, similar to other factions in the game, like, say, the Argent Dawn at the level cap of Vanilla, rewarded persistent dedication to their cause with shiny top-level trinkets. This time, however, their quests were shorter, largely contained to their own little perch on the top of those mountains, and, most importantly, a large chunk of them were repeatable every day. So, when done adventuring for the day, I would routinely soar above the treetops and spend half an hour to an hour or so working my way around the concentrated quest zones and nudge my progress one step closer to the precious rewards at the end. And I was still having a great time. And eventually I got a Sporebat, but I didn't really like it because the camera was fixed at unusually high position for mount, and it made me feel a bit weird to ride. Anyway, the patches rolled by, and eventually the Isle of Keldanas appeared off the coast of northern Lordaeron, and the concept of the high-level daily quest hub was expanded considerably. Dozens of daily quests and several dungeons to work towards were all contained on one sizable island, and it was full of players, even in the small hours of the night. I can't remember a time I was unable to find a party. It was like a microcosm of the whole game itself in a bubble, contained on a single island at the very end. A prize effectively unlocked for your character after you'd beaten 70 levels worth of content, which was a lot. And most days, I would spend at least an hour or two happily making my circuit of the island, battling demons and accumulating gold for that all-important epic flying skill. Occasionally, I would get a wistful feeling as I thought back to the closest equivalent max-level content prior to the expansion. The Eastern Plaguelands, Silithus, Stratholme, Scholomance, they sat mostly empty now, where once they'd been full of top-level players. But they had served their purpose in the same way that Keldanas and the Skyguard areas now did. I didn't dwell on it much at the time. It made sense that there would be some redundancies like that in order to move the game on. And I was still having a great time. In fact, I think the Burning Crusade might have been my most active period in WoW. Inevitably, though, time continued, as it does, and after several years hanging out beyond the portal, I returned to Azeroth, and a cold wind blew across the sea from the north, and we felt the wrath of the Lich King. And it actually felt pretty good. I journeyed across the beautiful frozen waste of Northrend, and had a fucking good time doing so. Although the setting didn't quite strike the same chord with me that the Burning Crusade had, I still dug it a lot. The process of leveling was increasingly slick and accessible, and the story-driven aspects of the questing were strong and dynamic, helped in part by the new phasing mechanic. I eagerly progressed. The daily quests were back, spread out wider than before, and available to players in the zones they were questing in before reaching the level cap. Doing the round would take me all over the vast continent, through varied zones full of players questing. Then, much like the Isle of Keldanas before it, the Argent Tournament came, and focused the daily activities of the top-level players, but this time on a bigger scale, with more variation day to day, and would send me back and forth across Northrend until I knew the continent like the back of my hand. Plus, the hard work to get the Epic Flyer really paid off. Those zones were big. The game on the whole seemed to continue with a lot of directions laid out in the Burning Crusade, which I was more than happy with. And then, having gotten quite nice and comfortable in Dalaran for a few years, Cataclysm came. The expansion tore through World of Warcraft in the form of a big, evil dragon. The old world that had sat serving as the long, slow first part before players got to the flashy new content was given a makeover. New features littered the zones, and the slack was taken in to bring the old quests more in line with the speed and pacing of then-current quests. What was once an epic odyssey became a mid-length tutorial, focused more on easing players into the mechanics of the game while on a sightseeing tour of Azeroth, all in preparation for the latest fresh content. The fundamental purpose of the old world had changed necessarily to facilitate the evolution of the game. It brought me a brief sadness to reflect on the changing of the old lands that I'd lived in for so many days and nights, but sometimes the old must be cut back to make way for new growth. So in good faith, I dove into World of Warcraft Cataclysm with much excitement. But the new growth was different. Something I couldn't identify straight away was missing. The new zones were individually beautiful, but kind of disparate, unconnected. Literally unconnected. It was the first expansion where the new high-level areas were not a cohesive landmass. Instead, little pockets tucked away, hidden, odds and ends. An underwater level, an underground level, an Egyptian level, a repurposed map from a long redundant vanilla raid, Mount Hyjal, that did look conspicuously older than the others. And then finally, to finish the loose elemental theme, the Firelands, the top-level daily quest hub, just as the Argent Tournament and the Isle of Keldanas, and maybe arguably Silithus, had been before it. And phasing, previously introduced in Wrath, was a lot more prevalent. Often zones would seem curiously devoid of players, right until I finished a particular key questline and was brought into the phase of the world where all the other players are. It felt strange, wondering how many players were hopping around the same zone in a parallel existence, invisible to me. It made the world feel less whole. Everyone wasn't seeing the same thing. They might as well have been on another server, which they usually were in the case of dungeons. The Dungeon Finder feature had been introduced and took from a cross-server pool of players. Long gone were the days when you would have to manually advertise your intent of dungeoneering in the general chat of the zone where the relevant dungeon was housed, and then, once you had found and auditioned a suitable party, actually go to the entrance of the dungeon and step inside. Now you open a UI window, select your dungeon and roll, and wait. The system sorts out a group and teleports you inside the dungeon. Because the players might have gone nowhere near the pre-dungeon quest lines out in the world, all quests are now conveniently available right at the entrance of the dungeon. Evidently aiming to be much more accessible, dungeons now usually take 20 to 30 minutes maximum, down from at least an hour or two. Older dungeons were now also noticeably shorter. A lot of this was put in place for good reason. The journey from 1 to 85 covered a lot more content than 1 to 60, and was considerably faster paced, meaning that content a leveling player did was spread out more thinly than before, like butter scraped over too much bread. You'd skip a lot of quests in any given area, simply because there were now far more than you needed. In an afternoon or two, I would rush through zones that once occupied me for weeks and move on to the next, leaving relatively little impression on me. Player interaction in the leveling zones was also minimal, and there was no need for it. Quests were all soloable to avoid uncompletable group quests in zones where you couldn't be guaranteed to reliably find groups, or other players at all. The community of players had also become insular, being largely entirely at max level as servers got older with fewer new players. It mostly filtered into guilds dedicated to specific game modes such as PvP or raids, and the world itself had lost cohesion. Gone were the days when the world was two seamless continents, with a single loading screen representing the ocean in between. Now your journey to the maximum level was a fast-paced trip through more zones than I could count or remember. A blurred series of brief fantasy vignettes that you hop between through portals or zip past on your flying mount. The world seemed somehow less real or tangible. A mountain was just an image of a mountain that you idly notice as you soar overhead towards the quest marker on your map. Previously, a mountain was a mountain between you and your quest, an obstacle that required navigation. Does this path lead over the mountain or into a cave of ogres? Enough of an obstacle to give pause for thought. It made you respect the mountain-like qualities of the mountain. Having to spend more time in the zones you played in made the world feel like a world. And sharing that world with other players in the same position as me made that world feel alive. But this wasn't that. The world that I loved had changed, and partly through necessity, to accommodate its latest iteration. And with sad acceptance, I felt it slowly but inexorably lose its grip on me. After more than 5 years, my time with World of Warcraft was coming to an end. It didn't give me the feeling that it once did. And so I unsubscribed, and with a heavy heart, I left the shores of Azeroth, and my life moved on. I played other games, but none even remotely as attentively or habitually as World of Warcraft. Mists of Pandaria came along, and I watched it from the outside and thought, what the fuck happened? And people liked the Pandaren when they were kind of a semi-tongue-in-cheek bit part in Warcraft 3, and I would have thought they might appear in the game at some point or another, but as the basis for an entire expansion, it just looked tonally weird. I kept away. Occasionally, I would look back at those early days of World of Warcraft with rose-tinted glasses and felt a warm feeling, but then sad, knowing that returning wouldn't be the same. Unlike Star Trek The Next Generation, which I could always pop into my DVD player, that particular experience of World of Warcraft was lost, preserved only in screenshots. It was an earlier, younger time in my life, sweetened by fond memory, and, much as I wanted to, I couldn't go back. So it was much to my surprise when, a few years later, Blizzard somehow managed to fucking reel me back. What? How? What is this? Warlords of Draenor? A return to Outland, revisiting my cherished home during the Burning Crusade. New takes on old places that I loved. Warlords lured me back with the promise of the past. It stirred in me those warm feelings I had so strongly associated with that world all those years ago. The attraction was enormously powerful. Would it be possible to revisit that glory? Maybe not. Maybe. Dare I take the chance? Yes, I damn well dared. Blizzard made a great game that had a huge impact on me and hooked me for a long time. Why couldn't they do it again? They did right by me for many years, and I was very happy to forgive a couple of expansions that weren't quite my cup of tea. And so, I opened my heart and let World of Warcraft back into my life. The only Mists of Pandaria content I played was in the fortnight preceding the launch of Warlords, and I only had a few thoughts about it. While I found the tone jarringly out of place with the Warcraft I liked, I appreciated some aspects, primarily that it all took place on the one island. Not bad, I thought, briefly, but then Warlords launched, and I forgot about it entirely. Straight away upon entering Draenor, I was intoxicated with a mix of Burning Crusade nostalgia and excitement at all the shiny new features. I enjoyed exploring to find treasures and the phased story sections that told a more dynamic, character-driven tale than before. quests flowed smoothly from one zone to the next. The classes have been streamlined considerably since the early days, and combat seemed to have generally more active or spatial things going on in it to engage you, like spell interrupting, or needing to either avoid or sometimes stand inside areas of coloured whatever on the floor to avoid damage or debuffs. This is true of the dungeons as well. Flying mounts were not yet included, and getting around the world felt like more of an actual journey, navigating the contours of the land on foot. Definite positives there. And it felt good to be back among the Draenei. I really did love the Burning Crusade. I'd quite forgotten why I left in the first place. I became the proud commander of my garrison, commissioning exciting new structures of war and sending my followers to quest for me. I'd always wondered if player housing would ever be implemented in WoW, and this was kind of that. The weeks passed, and I quickly hit level 100 and began the endgame. I think. I did what there was to do at any rate, which was largely tend to my garrison. I'd log in, harvest the mine, process the ore via the blacksmith, get the rewards from my followers' quests, send them on new quests, sort the mail, sort the various tokens and items from their quests, sell them or give them to the appropriate NPCs within the garrison to do whatever they did with them, to make whatever they'd eventually make, take a portal to the expansion's relatively humble capital city, Stormshield, and do my auctions to keep stocked up on worthless gold, Hearthstone back to the garrison a minute later, and go to the bank to store excess knickknacks. This would have taken about 20 to 30 minutes at this point. If I was playing for longer, I may consider going to do the Apexis dailies to collect worthless Apexis crystals that I figure I might need at some point, because I vaguely remember collecting such tokens previously in WoW that I then used for stuff. Or I could do a quick dungeon with 4 silent players that I'd never see again, in order to collect gear that was being made mostly redundant by all the passive rewards for all the dozen or so click this and press OK style minigames that it turns out the garrison was. And because all the other players were similarly dicking around in their own instanced garrisons most of the day, I hardly saw anyone, except at the Apexis grinding zones, or when I went to Stormshield, where they were mainly stood around or sat on an enormous variety of increasingly huge and ridiculous mounts, clad in thoroughly over-designed armor that was suffering from over a decade's worth of epic creep, to the point that the average player looks like an angel covered in glowing runes and elaborate protrusions, blithely waving around weapons that look more like grandiose, absurdly overwrought sculptures from an art exhibition than a sword or a staff. And I didn't really relate to the other players in the way I used to. We were all just effectively playing our own private games, certain areas of which just so happen to act like multiplayer lobbies. Forming bonds and friendships with other players don't happen in the ways they used to, primarily because the framework for that to happen within has changed so much. There's no point questing with other players, because the quests were all designed to be completed solo, and take dungeons. You mostly pogo hop from boss to boss and get to the main dude succinctly and efficiently, but you'll never spend hours chatting to your teammates in the dungeon group as you crawl your way painstakingly through a punishing dungeon that sometimes you're all slightly under-geared or leveled for, pushing past wipe after wipe with sheer determination, learning and growing as a team, or sometimes not, to be fair, and all because you'd come so far already, and you just want to finally get this one quest done to get at that delicious prize that waited so tantalizingly in the quest log for you to look at. Now, players invest so little in the entire process that often a single wipe will see many instantly write off the endeavour and abandon ship. In the process of making everything easier and more accessible, players now have precious little struggle to share with each other. And you know what? That was the fucking point of the game. Maybe it wasn't even intended as the point of the game, but it was a part of the game from the start, and it was what I enjoyed about it. I quite like when a game is punishing and slowly paced in the way that Vanilla WoW was. The time and effort players have to invest in the game to get somewhere now are vastly less than they once were, and the rewards definitely don't seem as sweet. The game I was playing had all the familiar trappings of the World of Warcraft I remembered, but it was a decidedly different game. Not a game I cared to play. While the setting evoked things I liked about the Burning Crusade, it became increasingly apparent that the game mechanics had continued to expand and evolve many of the things I didn't like about Cataclysm. And so, after a few months of Garrisons of Draenor, I ceased to care and let my subscription lapse. For me, the World of Warcraft that I loved was in the past, and I couldn't go back. And again, WoW fell out of my life. For a brief while. Then, something momentous happened. Then came the age of Nostalrius. I went back to the World of Warcraft that I loved, Vanilla WoW, patch 1.12.1 to be specific. Blizzard, having long declined to support anything but the most recent iteration of World of Warcraft, were not providing this service. It was a privately owned server run by players who, like me, loved the old game and had taken it upon themselves to provide it to the world once again, as it was in the Golden Age. And their effort was magnificent. A near-perfect recreation of what World of Warcraft once was, with an overflowing, healthy population. The nostalgia rush when I first logged on was intense. It was like I just stepped back 10 years in time. What I thought was gone forever was here once more, and oh my god, did it feel pretty good to be back in those places. But the nostalgia wasn't what kept me there. In fact, the more I got used to being back in each zone, the more it felt like I hadn't ever left. I was just caught up in the moment whenever I played, enjoying the process. And then, months had gone by. The game kept me playing. The slow, gentle rhythm of questing across the world, back and forth like the tide, the ebb and flow, getting a feel for the shape of the land again, getting into the swing of the game, the promise of the long, arduous journey to 60 and the paths it would take me down across Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms, and the other players I was already sharing it with kept me playing, and over the months it rekindled the passion that I have for this particular game, for the World of Warcraft. Just you, your avatar, the world, and a goal. The goal is 60. The only way to do it? Get out there and quest. And just enjoy the journey. Beautiful. And the garrison seemed just like a bad dream. It was a good time. In some way, I felt like a part of me had returned home. After a voyage away so lengthy that I'd forgotten I ever lived there. There were regular occasions when, in the middle of questing, I paused, leaned back and thought, man, I'm just so happy to be playing this WoW again. A sentiment often shared by the people playing alongside me. It was not only great, but kind of brought into focus exactly how much World of Warcraft has been a part of my life. It was and is important to me. It felt almost spiritual. And then Cataclysm came again. Blizzard Entertainment descended like an evil dragon and served the noble custodians of this little piece of history with a fucking lawsuit. Because no one really wants to get sued by a massive corporation for providing, for free and out of love, a service that said corporation effectively discontinued and doggedly refused to provide or even acknowledge the demand for, they understandably relented and shut down Nostalrius to avoid litigation and wrecked lives. Now, my initial feelings were that Blizzard, once a game company dear to me, had now become a big old shit. However, that may turn out to be premature. If Blizzard did intend to launch legacy servers, shutting down anyone providing the same service for free would be a legit move to prepare for that. And I really hope they do, not least because World of Warcraft has been steadily losing subscribers for quite a few years now. It looks like the only way they can get even a momentary spike of renewed interest is by releasing content that evokes a time in their past when WoW was more successful. If you've ever seen a bar graph of WoW's subscriber numbers before they stopped making them public, a telling sign, you know what I mean. It looks like a hill with Wrath in the middle. There's a little spike on the far slope where Warlords of Draenor recaptured some of WoW's audience by reminding them of past glory, and then a steep slope where, probably like me, they realize the game it has become can't deliver on the promises of that same glory anymore. Ultimately, I believe that manufacturing World of Warcraft's brilliance and success was like capturing lightning in a bottle. All the elements happened to be delicately balanced just right to create the perfect state of a game, compelling enough to gather a hardcore fan base willing to devote fair chunks of their lives to it. That Blizzard sustained this direction for several expansions attests to their skill as developers and the quality of the game. But, over time, the trajectory has changed, and taken WoW along a different course than the one it set down. And maybe you like where it's going, and that's fine, but it's no good for me. It's not the game I grew up with, and it's not a game that can sometimes make me feel good to go to if I'm feeling a bit shitty. It's not a game I hate, it's just not a game I want to play. I suppose normally I would have said that trying to bottle lightning again and again would be a foolhardy endeavour, but the analogy somewhat falls apart when you have an infinite supply of lightning, and a vast array of bottles at your disposal, and a machine to neatly put all the lightning into the bottles, and a potential audience of thousands upon thousands of alienated lightning fans who would pay you money to play your lightning. God damn it. I don't want to end this with a stream of bile directed at Blizzard. They made something that I love, And yeah, it's a video game, but most people love things that, when broken down to their constituent parts, aren't much. Does it diminish the passion for said thing? No. Humans are mostly just water, for fuck's sake, but I like a few of them quite a lot. Maybe some things are more than the sum of their parts. And in this life, if you find something you enjoy that isn't at the cost of suffering elsewhere, then that's fucking A-OK by me. And one of my things is World of Warcraft. So it does seem rather petty and spiteful of Blizzard to go out of their way to shut down the fans who want to play the version of their game that Blizzard have moved away from and won't even let them pay for. And it does seem rather shitty and disrespectful to casually dismiss the people who say they want to play old WoW with "you think you want it, but you actually don't," as one particular developer responded once. Most of those people being the fans who played and supported the original game all those years ago and who made up a part of that important stepping stone that Blizzard took on their own journey from just being a cool game company to one of the most insanely financially successful companies ever to have anything to do with video games. And of course, I'm not saying that Blizzard owe their success to the core fanbase of one of their games during a part in its history, but would they have the same massive platform and audience they enjoy today if WoW hadn't been the runaway success it was in those early years? Who can say? But no, of course they fucking wouldn't. And it does feel a tad insulting to hear that, despite apparently thinking we want it with our whimsical, childlike brains, we actually don't want it at all. A good thing you knew that what we actually wanted was the latest expansion pack. Oh gee, thanks whoever the fuck you were. I'm glad you know me better than I do. If you ever have a spare minute or two, I'd like to get some clarifications about some other things I want. Oh, I think I like them, having had them before, but I just can't trust my own dumb brain to make these decisions for me. Ho ho ho. You fucking cunt. I don't want to end this on a negative. I really hope that one day Blizzard decides to support older versions of World of Warcraft. I'd love to see that, and so would a lot of other people. It would be nice. I've come far with WoW, and I'd like to continue to enjoy it from time to time. It would be a shame if the journey came to an end with bitterness. So, here's to the World of Warcraft that was. My favorite game. It was always there. May it live again.